And we had a chance to talk about the Boston Share Network, which I would imagine a fair amount of people here know about it, but it's the 10th anniversary of the Boston Share Network, going into the shelters, many folks from the Acton Concord area, going in and providing moving expenses, assistance, clothing, other assistance to individuals living in shelters in Boston. So it's just a tremendous effort that is happening out here that's having an impact, in this case, in Boston. And then I wanted to recognize Julie Stanwood with Friends of Families in Transition from Northborough. And the district I represent goes out to the Northborough, Southborough, Westborough area, where, as I mentioned, there are many homeless families being placed in motels. And Julie and her team have just done a tremendous job providing that additional support that, unfortunately, state government is not yet meeting fully that demand. So, Julie, I just want to thank you for your efforts, and it really is tremendous what people are doing at the local level. I think what I would urge people to think about, again, thinking about what's going on in your community, is that there is money available to build affordable housing. I think that Aaron had touched upon it a little bit, but one of the major efforts that the Housing Committee put forward that the legislature passed this past year was a $1.5 billion affordable housing bond bill. So that's $1.5 billion that will be spent over the next 5 years to build affordable housing throughout Massachusetts. And just a quick example of the impact that each and every community and that you can have is in the town of Acton, where I live, is what the Acton Housing Authority did on property that it owned was it put forward a proposal to build 12 units of housing, which received some tax credits and also some subsidies the state provides. But what they insisted was that 4 of those 12 units be set aside for homeless families. So in other words, they insisted that this wasn't just available for anyone who applied for those 12 housing units, but they insisted that 4 of those units, so 1/3 of those units, would be set aside for homeless families. I had a chance to meet one of those families 2 weekends ago, a family that had been living in shelter in the city of Lynn for about a year, and now they're in Acton. Their kids are in the Acton public schools, and they're very stabilized and very, very happy. If every community in Massachusetts would step up and show that level of support, where you're using perhaps town land or housing authority land, you're putting in local money like CPA dollars, and then accessing the state money that's now available through that housing bond bill, we can make sure that there's a place for affordable housing for low-income families, including homeless families, in every single community. And that's very, very important to think about. The other big piece related to that is sort of what are we doing to making sure that multifamily housing is available in every community. I know here in Concord does an exceptional job of building affordable housing. My hometown of Acton, I'm very proud of the work that Acton does. And there's a couple other key towns in the district I represent that do an excellent job. But not every community is like that. And one of the big issues that, again, is not a budget issue, but it's the issue of zoning reform. And it's an issue that I've been very passionate about. I worked closely with Aaron when he served as the director of CHAPA to look at what are we doing to making sure that every community is looking to support through local zoning bylaws supporting multifamily housing. In the town of Acton, what the Housing Authority and the Affordable Housing Corporation did was they took an old school, the old high school, the old Acton High School, and they turned it into housing units for the elderly and for low-income families. Some of those seniors who actually went to that school growing up and now are living in their homeroom or their classrooms. But the point is that that kind of housing can be made available. It really takes the political will at the local level. So I know that each and every one of you is doing advocacy to us, whether it's to Jay Kaufman, to Jen Benson, or Corey Atkins, who I know were here earlier, Ken Gordon, doing that kind of advocacy at the state level with the budget priorities. And certainly the one that I'm fighting the hardest for is the MRVP funding, because we've had such an increase, and we can really see, if we can get that increase to $87.5 million, we can issue hopefully around another 2,000 vouchers be made available for families across Massachusetts, including hopefully for some families in shelter and motels. But beyond sort of that advocacy at the state level, making sure you reflect and think about what is my community doing to build affordable housing. Can my housing authority or can my selectmen or city council prioritize some of that funding for homeless families, because unless each and every community is stepping up to do its part, I think it's going to be much more difficult over the many, many years to reduce our homeless families and homeless individuals in Massachusetts. So thank you so much for being here. This is always one of the events I look forward to. I can't thank you enough for your advocacy. And as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, I look forward to working with you to end homelessness in Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Eldridge. You are a gift to us. You really are. And we thank you for your support over the years. And once again, we have some time for questions and answers. But per the suggestion, are we going to? Let's see. Yeah, let's move on. Okay, that's good, because we are a bit behind here. So next, we have with us a gentleman who we're looking forward to hear from. Representative Ken Gordon from Bedford. He's been a lawyer for 24 years, served as state representative in the 27th Middlesex District, including his hometown of Bedford, as well as Burlington and Wilmington, Precinct 3. He's been a lawyer for 24 years. The last 14, he has specialized in representing employees who suffer discrimination or wrongful termination at the workplace. Ken's professional experience attracted him to politics, as he now works to protect employees' rights as a member of the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development, as well as small business and those who rely on a helping hand from our communities. Representative Gordon will speak on homelessness coming to our suburbs. I'm sure we've all read about Bedford and its work with homeless at their motel. Please welcome Representative Ken Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. How's that microphone level? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you to the Advocacy Network to End Family Homelessness and Cooperative Metropolitan Ministries and the co-sponsors, and to the organizers, Carl and Frank, and to Kelly. Thank you for having me. And I'm really honored and humbled to be able to speak with you with Aaron Gornstein here, the Undersecretary, who's been so helpful to us in Bedford with respect to the families living in the motel and the community, as you'll hear, and some of the issues that it faced, and to be speaking after and sitting with Senator Eldridge, who's also been a great inspiration with all of the work that he's done in the state legislature. In September of last year, our story began when Bedford School Superintendent John Sills reported to the Finance Committee that an unexpectedly high number of students housed in the motel used as a shelter for homeless families in town was contributing to a spike in enrollment. The number of families at the motel had increased from 30 the prior spring to 88 in the fall. As the Undersecretary said, that was due to a spike in overall homelessness. And the number of children educated at the school, between those who were at the school and those who were being transported to their home community pursuant to a federal law called McKinney-Vento, that increased to 108 from 66 the prior spring. It received its attention in the media, and according to Superintendent Sills, when he announced that the town was spending $40,000 a month for the education of the students, the uproar certainly began. I knew that Bedford had been contributing to the needs of homeless families for several years. It was nothing new. The previous spring, I joined Senator Mike Barrett, who appeared at this conference last year, as we toured the facility and we learned a little bit about the lives of the families who were living there. There were about 30 families staying at the motel at that time, as I said. Many of the parents did not speak English. Those that did told us at that time and at subsequent visits that I made there that they were grateful for the opportunity for safe and dry shelter, but that they longed for the day that they would be able to go home. Bedford, like many communities, is what I would call a more of a minivan suburb, and the people that were living in the motel, for them, it was far away from their home communities. Very little is within walking distance of the motel. There's only one bus route that runs through the center of town. There's no laundromat, and for a time, the residents of the motel did not have access to a laundry facility there. There was no doctor or dentist that took Mass Health nearby. They had trouble getting care providers. Volunteers from the community came to try to organize help, and even some people here today came to me and told me that they were willing to help, and we really appreciate that. There's no cafe or gathering spot that is available in Bedford because, again, people drive cars in Bedford. They really, for the most part, there aren't that many people reliant on public transportation, and as you may know, having a car disqualifies as an asset many people from being able to participate in the program. People in the motels were spending too much of their money on local fast food restaurants and prepared foods because they weren't able to have kitchen facilities in the motel because of building code provisions. About a third of the adults living at the hotel were low-wage workers, mostly minimum-wage workers. Another third were staying behind to care for the children of the workers who were going out to work, and yet another third were looking for work. A few days after John Sill's report, I received an email that warned me that several residents wanted to speak with me about the issue of the number of families housed in the motel. They were going to attend one of my monthly meetings, one of my monthly office hours that I had arranged at a local coffee shop. Now, this is my freshman term as a state legislator. And I thought it would be a good idea when I took office if I scheduled a little monthly gathering at a coffee shop, and I did that, and I usually had maybe 3 or 4 people, never all at the same time. They would trickle in and trickle out, and I never had any problem talking to everybody one at a time. Well, this time I knew things would be different, and so I immediately arranged to have my next meeting at Town Hall. And there was a nice little room that held about 15 people, and I thought that might be appropriate, so I booked that room. I started getting more emails, and I started seeing more things on social media, so I called the town manager's office, and I thought, well, maybe the room that holds 30 people or up to 50 might be more appropriate. And he said, why don't you book both rooms and see how it goes? So I thought ahead again, and I arranged for the chief of police to come to the meeting. I arranged for the school superintendent to come to the meeting. And I arranged for one of the volunteers in town who had done a lot within the motel itself to help the people. That's Ann Guay, who I saw here, I think is here in the room with us. And together we could address many of the rumors that I saw circulating among emails and among social media, most reliant on misinformation, to try to address some of the concerns of the community that was now relying on a lot of this grapevine material. Well, as soon as I got there, I realized that 15-person room was never going to work. So we put a note on the door, and we headed downstairs to the next room. And when I got there, people started coming, and then we headed upstairs to the largest room in the building, and we must have looked like a little caterpillar, actually a large caterpillar, going from room to room in the building. At the outset, most of the opinions expressed fear, and they expressed outrage. According to the opinions, according to the residents, crime was on the rise. School classrooms were overcrowded. Fights were breaking out on the buses. The town's residents felt that they had a right to vote on who comes and goes within the community. There was a recent program on PBS, and I think it's still available online, and it documents some of the feeling of some of the members of our community who had reactions to the problem of homelessness coming into the suburbs, and especially to our suburb of Bedford. We addressed the rumors. According to the chief of police, there was no measurable increase in crime in town due to the residents of the hotel. There was only one incident that had involved any resident of the hotel, and that was statistically consistent with having 88 families move into town. There was some financial impact within the school system, but we could also handle that because we already handle an influx of students who come to us in the high schools to be educated. They live at Hanscom Field. And there was a real impact to the town in advancing funds for the transportation of kids whose family wanted them to go back to their home community, because the town has to advance that money. And as I said, $40,000 is a lot of money for the budget of a small town. After that meeting, the town manager followed up, and he scheduled a meeting to occur 2 weeks after that initial one. And in the meanwhile, I researched the issue of at that time, what was 4,000 families in the various types of shelters in Massachusetts. And that included the motels in the suburbs used as shelters, where they were located, how many families were assigned to each, the condition of these facilities, and the experience of the families. Between these meetings, the social networks and email communications continued to come in, and they continued to go to town hall, and they were reflecting now more than one point of view. There were the complaints that continued to complain of increased crime despite the evidence to the contrary. I received a large number of complaints about motel residents loitering in the parking lot, although there's no place else for them to go. A number of people suggested these folks should be looking for work rather than outside the facility, despite the fact that, as I said, a third of them did work, but it didn't seem to matter. And their pay was not enough to keep them out of poverty. I did receive a complaint, and there was a question here. It's a good question. Why is it that we're spending $82 a night on these motel rooms for what was 88 families times the number of nights in a year? And the reason is that this is a last gap measure to address those people who need shelter, those families who need shelter, when there's no place else for them to go. It's not the program of first resort by any means. While reflecting fear, suspicion, xenophobia, all of those issues did persist, but I was also getting word from other people who were reacting to those comments, including local clergy, explaining that we should be proud to be in a position to help those less fortunate by sharing our wonderful schools, our playgrounds, and our culture. There was a concern that those who complained about the presence of homeless families were acting more out of fear, and that this attitude does not reflect the true nature of Bedford's generosity. We had a tremendous amount of positive intervention coming in at that point, but also that had been going on all along. The Department of Children and Family Services, headed by Sue Baldoff, who I also see here, remained involved in providing a better experience for the children of the families in the hotels. Ann Gray, who I now see here, continued to do her work to make sure that the families had, for example, a laundromat. They now have a laundry facility within the hotel. The Bedford Family Connection, a group of volunteers, conducted an art program within the motel. The Bedford Cultural Council funded that program by providing even more money than they initially had requested. The local churches and civic groups made meals, donated clothing, toys, and other necessities and other niceties. Senator Barrett and I worked to make sure the children had access to medical and dental care. But there was a division that grew in Bedford between those who wanted to be sure Bedford treated all of the homeless families as welcome additions to the community and those who were looking for them as subtractions from the community. The majority of residents, however, most of the people that came to me really wanted Bedford to do its part. They were mindful that the number of families that was housed within the town was a great number. The 88 families, what I did was I went out and I took into account the population of Bedford, which is 4,500 people. I looked at, as I said, every other community that had a motel within its borders, and I looked at that population. And I essentially did the math, and I was able to meet with Undersecretary Gornstein, and I laid out that problem. And I said, we're willing to do our share, but we can't afford to do this great of a share, especially when it came to the expenses that were affecting the school system. Undersecretary Gornstein responded that minute, right at that meeting when he saw that, and he said that he would address the number of families and bring the number of families in Bedford down, not by moving families willy-nilly out of the facility, and I didn't want that, but by addressing the nature of the number of families there as he was assigning new families to shelters within the Commonwealth. At this point, we have 43 families. So we're down from a high of 88. We now have 43 families in Bedford. And that's good news for Bedford. It's also good news for the Commonwealth because it means that the 45 families that have another place to stay have been moved to a better place. So I see I'm running out of time. I want to address a couple of issues as to what's happened within the community. One of the matters that, as you heard in my introduction, I am an employment lawyer. And one of the things that I think is going to help, and it's going to help with homelessness, is when we address the minimum wage. Families who live in this motel, by and large, are surviving not only on public assistance, but on minimum wage jobs where they're making, with a 40-hour job, they're making $16,040 a year. You heard that the average rent in Massachusetts is $18,000, is more than that. So these families cannot live on one full-time job at minimum wage. They're required to live on 2 or 3 or even 4 full-time jobs on minimum wage. Families can't do that and raise their children. So we have a responsibility, and I'm working hard in the House to try to work toward a bill that will raise that wage. The Senate has done it. The governor is in favor of it, and we've got to continue to do that. And we've got to do that in a way that does not affect unemployment insurance benefits, because you may have heard that on the House side there's been a discussion about a balancing act in which unemployment insurance benefits may be affected. Again, the wage has to be raised, but people that find themselves out of work through no fault of their own shouldn't be paying a price for the increase in that wage. This will help us. This will help address homelessness. It will help us to address poverty. And before I close, the difference I've noticed in Bedford, people have now seen, the numbers have come to a manageable number. They realize now that we have a problem with poverty in this community, and they realize that what will get those numbers down in Bedford and otherwise is to put people back to work, get their wages up so that they can afford to put a roof over their head and food on the table when they are working. And when I talk to people in town, earlier they were business owners, some small business owners would complain about, well, I can't afford to pay labor any more than I'm paying. I'm struggling as it is. Now what they're telling me is, you know what, I understand that workers need to make more money. I can see that. I concede that. I'm having a little bit of a problem within my business of paying that increased wage, but I can't begrudge the workers who need it. And so therefore, it comes to us to find ways, for example, with helping with transportation problems and other issues, that will help these businesses to address their role in paying that increased wage, which I'm seeing through this situation that they understand the need to do it. So again, thank you for your time. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you very much, Representative Gordon. That was a very good statement, and frankly, a strong endorsement for the service work that a lot of you and our communities are doing and will probably have to do. And also to point out to us that sometimes it takes a gear shift in our understanding and our perception of the problem and the people who are affected by these problems before we can get into it and help out. And now we're at the threshold of our rolled up Q&A question. And I think I'd like to suggest a couple of little rules here. First of all, I get the first question. But second, please wait, address your question to one of our speakers so we know who will be addressing it. And secondly, please wait for the mic before you ask the question. I have a question that's occurred to me for Mr. Gorenstein, and I'm not sure there's a good answer to this, but you mentioned the trends, the increasing number of people who have been experiencing problems and coming forward, and it has been like an avalanche, really. What are your thoughts about what the trend is going forward? Are we going to see a continuing increase in numbers next year? Is that going to tail off? Is there any way to know? It's very hard to predict, I know, but perhaps you could just comment on that for a second. This comes out. That would be nice. Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, fortunately, really since December, we've seen a leveling off of the caseload of those who are coming in, either applying or then becoming eligible for emergency shelter. It's still a high number. It's more in the 450 families a month as opposed to 600, 650 that we are seeing over the summer and into the fall. So that's a very good sign that that huge spike is starting to come down, and that's why we're able to make progress. If it reverses back up, and I am concerned about the summer months again and trying to really gear up, what can we do around diversion and prevention? And I think that's what we need to focus more on. How do we reach families earlier before they get into a situation where they have no alternatives? Kelly spoke a little bit about this, but the outreach that has to occur, so when a family's getting evicted, how do we intervene earlier so that they don't end up at our office where it's almost too late? They have no other options, no alternatives. That's why they're there at the local office. And then we, as I said, we have to place them that same day. So I'm hopeful the leveling off will continue, but I think we need to be mindful of planning ahead for possibly another spike, which I hope doesn't happen, but is always a possibility.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, we now open the floor. All right, the lady in the back of the room.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. For Mr. Gornstein, I just want to say I spent some time in Bedford with the families in Bedford, and with Representative Gordon said there's a lot of rumor and stuff that goes around town in Bedford. There's a lot of rumor that goes around the hotel. And in my just anecdotal experience, they don't necessarily feel like they know what's going on, and they don't feel like they have a caseworker. And the rumor is, I mean, every month or two, the rumor is they're all getting kicked out. But I've heard that the plan is to get all families out of motels, homeless families out of hotels and motels by June. Is that still your plan?
Yes, but we've obviously had a setback in terms of the numbers that we're experiencing, and that the numbers went back up. We were on track to do that early last year. If we need to use the motels and we need to place families, we will continue to do so. That's what the governor said. So it's not, we're not going to leave any family unserved come July 1st. If we need to continue use of the motels as a last resort, we're going to do that. It's important to have a goal, and it's important to rally everyone around that goal, because I think we all agree that the motels are not a good situation for the families. It's something we've had to do, but we're trying to do everything we possibly can through all the measures I mentioned to move the families into permanent housing, into other congregate, more supportive settings, and so they have access to all the services they need. So that's what I would say. We need to do a better job at reaching out to the families if they're not hearing from our providers or our state agency staff. So I appreciate the feedback there, and it's something we need to improve upon.
Yes, a question for Kelly. Can you give us a sense of the demographics? We've heard 4,400 families, but how many people is that? And what's the mix of men and women and children in particular?
Sure, and I think Aaron would probably be better to answer the question. In general, what we know is that families have about 2 children per household, and previous reports would show that about 95% of the households are female-headed households, single-parent households.
Next.
I can't get that one. I'm going to try right here.
Yeah. First, Senator Eldridge, I'm just curious with respect to the housing that you mentioned in terms of local communities. Are there standards for families as opposed to individuals who would take low income or units that are for home, that would be donated for whole families? Are there standards regarding recreational kinds of facilities or access to play structures or things like that, or yards, or anything along those lines that you could possibly address?
Sure. So just to follow up, do you mean is there a requirement for if a poor family? There's not. I mean, it's really just, you know, a unit has to be affordable, and then of course, you know, some public housing or affordable housing does have that access, and some doesn't. So, and I see a lot of that also as being the opportunity for a community to make sure that's the case. So, you know, making sure there's a a playground nearby as part of the construction of that affordable housing. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
We have one on the side over here.
Move in here, okay. I'm from Northborough, and I thank Senator Eldridge for his work, and I really thought all of your presentations were very informative. And while I appreciate that the congregate housing offers stability and allows children going forward to have stability with education, and I really appreciate the fact that the minimum wage raising would be helpful. What I'm not hearing is a lot of energy directed toward the education, the type of skill building that people need to long-term stabilize their lives and get them out of poverty. And I recognize that that's a national concern, but can you speak to that a little bit, would be my question.
Sure, and I can comment a little, and I think Rep. Gordon wants to comment too. But there is some funding in the budget each year for it's often under the Department of Transitional Assistance to train people who are receiving public benefits for better jobs. And then of course Governor Patrick has done an exceptional job of increasing investments in community colleges and higher education institutions. Some of which there's some grants and loans available to those who are less well off. But on the other hand, I think what you've seen, especially with the workforce training for DTA, is that's been cut over the past couple of years because of the 2008 fiscal crisis, and we're just getting back in many ways to the funding for many areas, whether it's public education or housing or human services. Rep. Gordon?
Thank you, Senator. And thank you for that question, because in the time that we had to provide our initial presentations, we didn't have an opportunity to talk about all these different issues. But that's an issue that's very important, and as the Senator said, it's something that you as advocates should be contacting your legislators to support, because yes, under both the assistance for families as well as the unemployment program, we have programs for training. We have programs for substitutes to working, which is to say that people are continued to be eligible for benefits as long as they're being trained or working, and we've got to continue to fund that. We're working hard to be able to do that, so these are very important programs. Thank you for that question.
Next question is right here.
Hi, my name is Natalie, and I'm here on behalf of Congresswoman Catherine Clark from the 5th Congressional District, which includes Lexington and Lincoln, some of the surrounding communities. And to piggyback off of some of the resource questions, we've talked about a lot of the great work that happens at the state level, and I'm wondering, perhaps aside from Section 8 vouchers, what other resources might be available at the federal level that we're not tapping into that we could be?
I'm not aware of anything that we're not tapping into. It's mostly, quite honestly, despite our congressional delegation is the best in the country on affordable housing and community development as far as I'm concerned, and they've been fighting that fight for many years. So in terms of the HUD budget, we're really trying to take advantage of every resource possible. They have cut the Section 8 program. They've cut the federal, when I say they, Congress, but it's really coming from the House of Representatives, cut the home program by half over the past 2 years. The federal home programs helps build more affordable housing. The community development block grant program, which both our larger cities and our smaller communities rely on, and we administer those on behalf of the smaller communities, that's been cut significantly. So it's really going in the wrong direction. The program that has stayed steady and even expand a little bit is the programs for veterans called the VASH program, which is a great program that provides housing supports for veterans, and we'll be applying for those vouchers shortly to HUD. So that's the program we're working closely with Veteran Services on, and that's one sort of the bright spot, I think, of all the federal housing programs that I'm aware of. Wish I had better news, but yeah.
Next question here.
Hi, thank you so much for everybody for coming today. It's been very educational, and it's great to know that we're moving forward as a region, as a state, and hopefully as a country. I really would like to speak to how in suburban communities, there are such compassionate people in the towns and the schools, part of the houses of worship, who are all coming together and organizing themselves, especially in Lexington right now, where I am. And we're learning that as much as we possibly can do to support these families, we have some gates that we need to go through, and those might be hotel owners, or they might be some other obstacles. And I just ask that if families are going to be placed in hotels, which I am sure they